The Philadelphia Corridor, a narrow strip of land running along the Egypt-Gaza border, has become a focal point of the ongoing conflict between Israel and Hamas. This seemingly insignificant stretch of land holds immense strategic importance for both sides, making it a battleground of symbolic and military significance. For Israel, control over the corridor is crucial to prevent the smuggling of weapons and fighters into Gaza. Hamas, on the other hand, sees the corridor as a lifeline, a conduit for essential supplies and a potential escape route. Named after one of the ancient gates of Gaza City, the corridor has been a flashpoint in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict for decades. After Israel's disengagement from Gaza in 2005, the corridor became the only point of entry and exit not controlled by Israel. This gave Hamas, which had seized control of Gaza in 2007, a degree of autonomy that Israel found unacceptable. The presence of militant tunnels used to smuggle weapons and launch attacks into Israel from the corridor has been a constant source of tension. The current round of fighting, which erupted in May 2023, has seen some of the fiercest battles in the corridor since the 2014 Gaza war. Israel Defense Forces have poured into the area, determined to dismantle Hamas's infrastructure and cripple its ability to wage war. Hamas, for its part, has vowed to resist the Israeli offensive with all its might, using the corridor's intricate network of tunnels and fortified positions to their advantage. The civilian population caught in the crossfire has paid a heavy price, with casualties mounting and displacement reaching unprecedented levels. The city of Rafah, straddling the Gaza-Egypt border and bisected by the Philadelphia Corridor, has been devastated by the fighting. Once a bustling hub of trade and commerce, Rafah is now a ghost town, its streets deserted, its buildings reduced to rubble. The ferocity of the fighting has left its mark on every corner of the city, with craters from airstrikes and artillery shelling dotting the landscape. The stench of death hangs heavy in the air, a grim reminder of the human cost of the conflict. The civilian population of Rafah, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, has borne the brunt of the violence. With nowhere to escape, they have been trapped in their homes, caught between the crossfire of Israeli airstrikes and Hamas rocket fire. Hospitals, already overwhelmed and undersupplied before the fighting began, have been pushed to the breaking point. The injured lie in corridors, waiting for treatment that often never comes, while the dead are buried in mass graves on the outskirts of the city. The battle for Rafah is more than just a military campaign. It is a struggle for survival. Israel sees the city as a stronghold of Hamas, a breeding ground for terrorism that must be neutralized at any cost. Hamas, on the other hand, views Rafah as a symbol of Palestinian resistance, a line in the sand that it cannot afford to lose. The outcome of the battle for Rafah will have far-reaching consequences for both sides, shaping the future of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict for years to come. The ongoing conflict has dragged on for months, with no end in sight. The death toll on both sides continues to rise, with thousands killed and tens of thousands injured. The vast majority of the casualties have been Palestinian civilians, many of them women and children. The relentless bombardment has shattered Gaza's already fragile infrastructure, leaving its people without access to basic necessities like water, electricity, and medical care. The war has also taken a heavy toll on the Israeli home front. Rocket attacks from Gaza have disrupted daily life in southern Israel, forcing millions to live in fear and seek shelter in bomb shelters. The conflict has also exacerbated political and social divisions within Israeli society, fueling tensions between Jewish and Arab citizens. The economic cost of the war is staggering. Gaza, already impoverished and heavily reliant on foreign aid before the fighting began, has seen its economy collapse. The destruction of infrastructure, businesses and farmland has dealt a blow to the livelihoods of millions. The cost of reconstruction is estimated to be in the billions of dollars, a daunting figure for a territory struggling to cope with a humanitarian crisis. The relentless violence and humanitarian crisis have triggered a mass exodus from Gaza. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians have fled their homes, seeking refuge in UN-run schools, mosques, and other makeshift shelters. The conditions in these shelters are dire, with overcrowding, inadequate sanitation, and shortages of food, water, and medicine. Many Gazans have attempted to escape the enclave altogether, crossing into Egypt through the Rafah border crossing. However, the crossing has been intermittently closed due to security concerns, leaving thousands stranded on both sides of the border. Those who have managed to cross into Egypt face an uncertain future with limited opportunities for work, housing, and healthcare. The displacement of Palestinians from Gaza is not only a humanitarian tragedy, it is also a political powder keg. The sight of hundreds of thousands of refugees fleeing the violence has fueled international outrage and condemnation of Israel's actions. The displacement has also raised fears of a renewed refugee crisis, similar to the one that followed the creation of Israel in 1948. Despite international calls for a ceasefire, the fighting rages on. Both sides remain entrenched in their positions, unwilling to make concessions that could be perceived as weakness. The conflict seems intractable, with no clear path to a resolution. The underlying issues that have fueled decades of conflict, including the status of Jerusalem, the right of return for Palestinian refugees, and the expansion of Israeli settlements, remain unresolved. The longer the conflict continues, the more difficult it will be to achieve a lasting peace. The cycle of violence and retribution has created a deep well of hatred and mistrust between Israelis and Palestinians. The trauma inflicted on both populations will take generations to heal. The international community has a responsibility to work towards a just and lasting solution to the conflict. This will require addressing the root causes of the conflict, including the occupation, the blockade, and the denial of Palestinian rights. It will also require holding all parties accountable for their actions and ensuring that those responsible for war crimes are brought to justice. The United States, Israel's closest ally, has found itself in a difficult position. The Biden administration has condemned Hamas's rocket attacks on Israeli civilians while also expressing concern about the humanitarian situation in Gaza. The US has provided millions of dollars in humanitarian aid to Gaza and has called for a ceasefire. However, the US has also blocked efforts at the United Nations Security Council to pass a resolution calling for a ceasefire. This has drawn criticism from some quarters who accuse the US of shielding Israel from international pressure. The US maintains that it is working behind the scenes to de-escalate the conflict. The Biden administration is facing pressure from both sides of the aisle in Congress, with some lawmakers calling for stronger support for Israel and others urging the administration to do more to hold Israel accountable for its actions. The conflict has put a strain on US-Israeli relations, highlighting the delicate balance the US must strike between supporting its ally and upholding its values. The international community has reacted with a mixture of condemnation, concern, and calls for restraint. The United Nations has called for an immediate ceasefire and has expressed grave concern about the humanitarian situation in Gaza. The European Union has urged both sides to de-escalate the violence and has called for a negotiated solution to the conflict. Arab and Muslim countries have condemned Israel's actions in Gaza, with some calling for a boycott of Israeli goods and services. Protests have erupted in cities around the world, condemning the violence and expressing solidarity with the Palestinian people. The conflict has also highlighted the divisions within the international community over the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Some countries, particularly in Europe, have been more critical of Israel's actions, while others have been more supportive. The conflict has underscored the need for a more unified international response to the crisis. Humanitarian organizations have been working tirelessly to provide aid to the people of Gaza. The United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East, or UNRWA, has been providing food, water, shelter, and medical care to displaced Palestinians. The International Committee of the Red Cross has been working to facilitate the delivery of humanitarian aid and to evacuate the wounded. However, the humanitarian response has been hampered by the ongoing violence, the destruction of infrastructure, and the restrictions imposed by both Israel and Hamas. The UN has called for unimpeded humanitarian access to Gaza, warning that the situation is dire and that many lives are at risk. The international community has pledged millions of dollars in humanitarian aid to Gaza. However, much more is needed to meet the needs of the millions of people affected by the conflict. The reconstruction of Gaza's shattered infrastructure will require a long-term commitment from the international community. The International Criminal Court, or ICC, has come under fire from both sides of the conflict. The ICC's decision to open an investigation into alleged war crimes committed in the Palestinian territories, including the recent conflict in Gaza, has drawn condemnation from Israel and its allies. Israel argues that the ICC has no jurisdiction over the matter and that the investigation is politically motivated. Hamas, on the other hand, has welcomed the ICC's investigation, hoping that it will lead to accountability for Israeli actions. However, Hamas has also been accused of war crimes, including the indiscriminate firing of rockets into civilian areas in Israel. The ICC has indicated that it will investigate all allegations of war crimes regardless of who committed them. The ICC's investigation has become a focal point of the political battle over the conflict. Israel has accused the ICC of being biased against it and has vowed to not cooperate with the investigation. The US has also expressed concerns about the ICC's investigation, arguing that it could undermine efforts to achieve a negotiated solution to the conflict. The ICC's investigation is likely to be a lengthy and complex process. It remains to be seen whether the ICC will be able to gather sufficient evidence to issue arrest warrants or whether any trials will ever take place. The ICC's track record in bringing perpetrators of war crimes to justice has been mixed, with some successes, but also some notable failures. The ICC's investigation, regardless of its outcome, has already had a significant impact on the conflict. It has raised the stakes for both sides, making it more difficult for them to engage in actions that could be deemed war crimes. The investigation has also highlighted the need for accountability and justice for the victims of the conflict. The pursuit of justice should not be seen as an obstacle to peace, but rather as an essential component of any lasting solution. A just and lasting peace cannot be built on impunity. Holding those responsible for war crimes accountable is essential to breaking the cycle of violence and preventing future atrocities.